Nobody expected the quiet man with the mop to have the power to destroy 3 successful careers in under a minute. Frank Martinez had been invisible for years, cleaning hallways while his 12-year-old daughter Sophia endured daily torment. From classmates who thought picking on the janitor's kid was harmless fun. But when their wealthy parents showed up to defend their little angels, they had no idea they were about to face a man whose past would shatter their perfect suburban facades forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the polished hallways of Riverside Elementary School at exactly 6:30 every morning, just as he had for the past 4 years. The wheels squeaked softly against the linoleum, a familiar sound that announced his presence to the empty classrooms and silent corridors. At 42, Frank had the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work, and eyes that held depths most people never bothered to notice. His navy blue uniform was always pristine, pressed with the same care he brought to every surface he cleaned, every corner he swept. The other staff members knew him as a man of few words who took pride in his work. He arrived before the sun, painted the Ohio sky pink, and stayed until long after the last school bus disappeared around the corner of Maple Street. Frank had a quiet dignity about him. The way he nodded respectfully to teachers, held doors for hurried parents, and never complained about the extra messes left behind after particularly chaotic school events. To most, he was simply part of the building's infrastructure, as reliable and unnoticed as the heating system or the fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. What they didn't see was how Frank's jaw tightened slightly when he overheard certain conversations, or how his grip on the mop handle became firmer when he witnessed moments of casual cruelty. They didn't notice the way his eyes tracked every interaction in the hallways, cataloging behaviors and patterns with the precision of someone trained to observe. Frank Martinez was many things, but invisible by choice was not one of them. He watched because he had to, because his daughter Sophia walked these same halls, and because he understood better than most how quickly a school environment could turn toxic. Sophia Martinez was everything her father was not when it came to visibility. Where Frank blended into backgrounds, Sophia stood out with her bright purple backpack, her collection of friendship bracelets, and her habit of humming Disney songs under her breath between classes. She had inherited her father's dark eyes, but filled them with an optimism that Frank worked hard to protect. At 12, Sophia possessed that particular kind of intelligence that made her ask uncomfortable questions about fairness and justice, the kind that made adults squirm and other children either admire or resent her. She loved science class with an intensity that worried her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, who wasn't used to students who actually read ahead in their textbooks. Sophia's desk was always organized, her homework always completed in neat handwriting that she'd practiced for hours because she knew education was the one thing no one could take away from her. She understood, in the way that children of working parents often do, that her father's long hours and careful budgeting were investments in her future. This understanding made her mature beyond her years, but also made her a target for classmates who couldn't comprehend why anyone would care so much about school. The bullying had started small, the way these things always do. Dylan Chen, 13, and already showing signs of the entitled swagger he'd inherited from his father, began with subtle exclusions. Sophia would approach a group of students discussing a project, and Dylan would pointedly turn his back, creating a physical barrier that made her presence unwelcome. Ethan Brooks, Dylan's constant companion, would snicker at these moments, providing the audience that bullies need to feel powerful. Madison Pierce, who wielded social influence like a weapon despite her young age, would roll her eyes dramatically whenever Sophia spoke in class, sighing loudly enough for everyone to hear. The progression was predictable, but devastating. exclusion, became whispered comments about Sophia's clothes, her father's job, the fact that she brought lunch in a brown bag instead of buying the hot meals. These whispers became louder discussions that Sophia was clearly meant to overhear, conversations about how some people just didn't belong at Riverside Elementary. The cruelty escalated when Dylan discovered that Sophia's father was the school janitor, a revelation that transformed their casual meanness into systematic humiliation. Frank first noticed the change in his daughter during their evening routine. Sophia had always been chatty during dinner, sharing stories about her classes, her teachers, the books she was reading. But gradually their conversations became shorter, her responses more guarded. She began asking odd questions about his work, whether he liked being a janitor, whether he ever wished he had a different job. Frank recognized the signs because he'd seen them before, in other places, other times. His daughter was being taught to feel shame about her family, about herself, about circumstances beyond her control. The Martinez apartment was small but comfortable, a two-bedroom unit in a complex that housed other working families. Frank had chosen it specifically for its proximity to Sophia's school, wanting her to be able to walk safely and never feel isolated by transportation issues. The living room served multiple purposes: homework station, entertainment center, and Frank's office, where he managed their careful budget and planned for Sophia's college fund. Every piece of furniture had been chosen for durability and function rather than style, but Sophia had decorated with artwork from school and photographs that captured moments of genuine happiness. Frank's evening routine included reviewing Sophia's homework, not because he doubted her academic abilities, but because these sessions gave him insight into her daily experiences. He could tell when she'd had a good day by her eagerness to share what she'd learned, and he could sense trouble by her reluctance to discuss social interactions. The careful questions he asked weren't invasive. They were strategic, designed to gather information without making Sophia feel like she was being interrogated. Frank had learned long ago that direct confrontation often drove problems underground rather than solving them. The first serious incident occurred on a Tuesday in October when autumn had painted Millbrook's trees in brilliant oranges and reds. Sophia was sitting alone in the cafeteria, reading a book while eating her peanut butter and jelly sandwich, when Dylan Chen approached with his usual entourage. The cafeteria was crowded, filled with the chaos of children eating lunch and teachers. Monitoring from the periphery, Dylan's voice carried across the room when he announced loudly that Sophia's lunch smelled weird, that maybe her father had found the ingredients in the school dumpster he was always emptying. The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was loud enough to draw attention from surrounding tables. Sophia's face burned with embarrassment as she tried to focus on her book, but Dylan wasn't finished. He grabbed her sandwich, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom, asking other students if they thought it was safe to eat food prepared by someone who spent their days cleaning up after other people. Madison Pierce contributed her own commentary about hygiene and proper nutrition, while Ethan Brooks made exaggerated gagging sounds that sent their table into fresh peals of laughter. Mrs. Thompson, who was monitoring lunch duty that day, witnessed the tail end of this performance, but arrived too late to understand the full context. She saw Sophia gathering her belongings with tears in her eyes, Dylan and his friends laughing at their table, and the general disruption that suggested something had gone wrong. When she asked what happened, she received the standard responses that teachers know usually indicate a more complex situation. Everything was fine, it was just a misunderstanding, no one did anything wrong. Sophia, when questioned, simply said she wasn't hungry anymore and asked to go to the library. Frank learned about the incident not from Sophia, but from his own observations. He noticed that she'd barely touched her lunch when she returned her lunchbox that evening, and he saw the way she hesitated when he asked about her day. More telling was what happened the next morning when he was mopping near the cafeteria and overheard Dylan bragging to another student about how easy it was to make the janitor's daughter cry. The casual cruelty in the boy's voice, the pride he took in causing pain, triggered something in Frank that he'd kept carefully controlled for years. That evening, Frank approached the conversation differently. Instead of his usual gentle questions about homework and friends, he asked Sophia directly if anyone at school was giving her trouble. The relief in her eyes when she finally had permission to tell the truth was heartbreaking. The story poured out of her in a rush, the comments about his job, the suggestions that she didn't belong at their school, the way other children avoided her because association with the janitor's daughter might hurt their own social standing. Frank listened without interruption, his expression calm, but his hands clenched in his lap. When Sophia finished, she looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding for a 12-year-old, asking if he was embarrassed by his job, if he wished he could be something else so she wouldn't have to deal with these problems. The question hit Frank harder than any physical blow could have, because it revealed how deeply the bullying had worked its way into his daughter's sense of self-worth. His response was measured but firm. He told Sophia that every honest job had dignity, that the work he did mattered, that she should never apologize for who her family was or what they did to support each other. But even as he spoke these words, Frank was making calculations, considering options, remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. He'd spent 4 years building a quiet life in Millbrook, creating a safe space for Sophia to grow up away from the complications of his past. Now that sanctuary was being threatened by children who didn't understand the power they were wielding, and parents who'd apparently never taught them basic human decency. The next few weeks brought an escalation that Frank watched with growing concern. Dylan Chen had discovered that targeting Sophia brought him attention and social currency, and he began recruiting other students to participate in what became systematic harassment. They would accidentally bump into her in hallways, knock books from her hands, make loud comments about cleanliness whenever she passed. Madison Pierce organized a campaign of social exclusion, ensuring that Sophia was never invited to birthday parties, study groups, or casual gatherings. Ethan Brooks contributed his own brand of cruelty by spreading rumors about the Martinez family's financial situation and living conditions. Frank began altering his work schedule to be present in areas where these incidents typically occurred. He witnessed enough to understand that this wasn't typical childhood conflict, but deliberate, targeted harassment designed to make his daughter feel unwelcome in her own school. The sophistication of the campaign suggested adult influences, children who'd learned these tactics from parents who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed rather than individuals deserving of respect. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in November when Frank was cleaning windows near the main entrance and saw Sophia sitting alone on the front steps crying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. School had ended 20 minutes earlier, and most students had already left. But Sophia remained huddled on the concrete steps with her backpack clutched against her chest. When Frank approached, she looked up with eyes red from tears and told him she'd been waiting for the buses to clear so she wouldn't have to walk past Dylan and his friends. That's when Frank learned about the latest incident. Dylan had cornered Sophia after math class, telling her that his father was a lawyer who could get people fired for any reason. He'd suggested that maybe Mr. Martinez would have to find work somewhere else if certain complaints were made to the school administration. Complaints about inappropriate behavior or unsatisfactory performance. The threat was sophisticated enough to suggest adult coaching, and it revealed a level of malice that went far beyond childhood bullying. Sophia had spent the rest of the day terrified that her presence at Riverside Elementary was somehow jeopardizing her father's employment. that the bullying she endured was creating problems that could destroy the stability Frank had worked so hard to build. The psychological manipulation was masterful in its cruelty, turning a child into an accomplice in her own torment by making her believe that seeking help would only make things worse. Frank Martinez had heard enough. Frank Martinez's investigation into his daughter's tormentors began the way all good intelligence gathering does, quietly, methodically, and with the patience of someone who understands that information is power. Over the weekend, while Sophia worked on homework at their small kitchen table, Frank used his laptop to research the families behind the children who were making his daughter's life miserable. What he discovered painted a picture of privilege and entitlement that explained everything about their children's behavior. Richard Chen lived in a sprawling colonial house on Millbrook's most prestigious street, complete with a circular driveway and landscaping that probably cost more than Frank's annual salary. His law firm, Chen and Associates, specialized in corporate litigation and had a reputation for aggressive tactics that skirted ethical boundaries. Frank found articles in the local business journal praising Richard's no-holds-barred approach to winning and his philosophy that nice guys finish last in the legal world. The man's LinkedIn profile read like a monument to his own ego, filled with humble brags about exclusive club memberships and charitable donations that were clearly more about tax benefits than genuine philanthropy. Jennifer Brooks presented herself as Millbrook's premier real estate agent, with a website featuring glamour shots that looked more suited to a modeling portfolio than professional headshots. Her social media presence revealed a woman obsessed with status symbols and material wealth, constantly posting about luxury car purchases, expensive vacations, and designer handbags. Her business model seemed to revolve around cultivating relationships with wealthy clients and maintaining an image of success that required constant financial investment. Frank noticed that many of her posts included subtle digs at people who couldn't afford her lifestyle, revealing a deep-seated insecurity masked by aggressive materialism. Amanda Pierce was perhaps the most interesting of the three parents because her entire career was built on manufactured authenticity. Her Instagram account, which boasted over 50,000 followers, positioned her as a mommy blogger and lifestyle influencer who shared the real truth about parenting and family life. But Frank could see through the carefully curated content to the calculated manipulation underneath. Every post was designed to sell something, whether it was sponsored products, affiliate links, or her own brand of parenting advice. Her daughter, Madison, wasn't a child in these posts, but a prop, posed and positioned to support whatever narrative would generate the most engagement and revenue. These parents had created children who viewed other people as either useful or obstacles, because that's how they navigated their own adult relationships. Dylan had learned from his father that intimidation was an acceptable problem-solving strategy. Ethan had absorbed his mother's belief that material possessions determined human worth. Madison had been trained to see other children as competition for attention and resources. None of these kids had been taught empathy, compassion, or the basic principle that other people's feelings mattered. Frank's research also revealed something else that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. All three families were heavily invested in their public reputations and social standing within Millbrook's community. Richard Chen's law practice depended on his image as a successful, ethical attorney. Jennifer Brooks's real estate business relied on her reputation as a trustworthy professional. Amanda Pierce's influencer income was directly tied to her follower count and brand partnerships, both of which could evaporate overnight if her carefully constructed image was damaged. Monday morning brought a new level of harassment that confirmed Frank's suspicions about parental involvement. Dylan approached Sophia during her first class with a confidence that suggested he'd received coaching over the weekend. He didn't say anything directly threatening, but his message was clear. His father had connections throughout Millbrook, including relationships with school board members and city officials. The implication was that the Chen family could cause problems for Frank's employment not just at Riverside Elementary, but anywhere in town. This wasn't the random cruelty of a 13-year-old boy anymore. This was strategic intimidation designed to isolate Sophia and her father from any potential sources of support or advocacy. Someone had taught Dylan that power came from controlling other people's options, limiting their ability to fight back or seek help. The sophistication of the approach revealed adult guidance and planning. Madison Pierce had also received new instructions, apparently. Her campaign of social exclusion expanded to include spreading rumors about Sophia's academic performance, suggesting that the only reason she did well in school was because her father had access to answer keys and test materials. The rumors were absurd to anyone who knew Sophia, but they served their intended purpose of undermining her reputation and making other students question whether associating with her might somehow compromise their own academic standing. Ethan Brooks contributed his own escalation by accidentally destroying Sophia's science project during lunch period. The project, a carefully constructed model of the solar system that Sophia had spent weeks perfecting, was knocked to the floor when Ethan stumbled into her table while carrying his lunch tray. The destruction appeared accidental to casual observers, but Frank knew better. He'd been watching from across the cafeteria and had seen Ethan's deliberate movement, the way he'd positioned himself to maximize damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The loss of her science project broke something in Sophia that Frank hadn't seen before. When she came home that evening, she didn't cry or get angry. Instead, she sat quietly at the kitchen table and asked him if they could move to a different town, maybe find a place where nobody knew them or cared what he did for work. The resignation in her voice was more heartbreaking than tears would have been, because it meant the bullies had achieved their ultimate goal. They'd convinced his daughter that the problem wasn't their behavior, but her existence. That night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Frank made a decision that would change everything. He'd spent 4 years trying to be someone else, building a new identity as a quiet janitor who minded his own business and avoided complications. But some situations required the skills and experience he'd tried to leave behind. His daughter was being systematically destroyed by children whose parents had never faced real consequences for their actions. It was time to remind them that not everyone in Millbrook was as powerless as they assumed. Frank began his own campaign on Tuesday, but his approach was different from anything the Chen, Brooks, and Pierce families had encountered before. Instead of targeting their children, he focused on the parents themselves, using information they'd made publicly available but had never considered could be weaponized against them. His first move was subtle. A carefully worded email to the Ohio State Bar Association about Richard Chen's recent social media posts, which included several statements that could be interpreted as soliciting clients through improper channels. The complaint wasn't frivolous, but it was strategic. Frank knew that bar associations took public image seriously, and that even unfounded complaints required investigation and response. Richard would have to spend time and money defending himself against charges that would never stick, but the process would create stress and uncertainty. More importantly, it would demonstrate that Richard Chen wasn't untouchable, that his aggressive tactics could be turned against him by someone who understood how professional oversight worked. Jennifer Brooks received a different kind of attention. Frank had noticed that several of her recent social media posts featured luxury items that seemed inconsistent with publicly available information about her business income. A few anonymous Tips to the IRS about potential unreported income wouldn't necessarily result in an audit, but they would certainly trigger additional scrutiny during her next tax filing. Frank also noticed that some of her recent real estate listings included photographs that showed unlicensed electrical work and potentially unsafe modifications, information that he shared with the appropriate city inspection departments. Amanda Pierce's vulnerabilities were different but equally exploitable. Her influencer career depended on brand partnerships and sponsored content, relationships that could be damaged by questions about her audience authenticity and engagement metrics. Frank had experience with social media analysis from his previous career, and it didn't take long to identify suspicious patterns in Amanda's follower growth and post-engagement. Several of her major sponsors received detailed reports about these irregularities, along with questions about their due diligence processes. None of these actions were illegal or unethical. Frank was simply using publicly available information and legitimate oversight channels to create the same kind of pressure these families had been applying to his daughter. The difference was that his approach was more sophisticated and targeted, designed to hit them where they were actually vulnerable, rather than where they felt strongest. The effects became apparent by Thursday. Richard Chen's confidence wavered when he received notification of the Bar Association inquiry, particularly because the complaint demonstrated detailed knowledge of legal ethics that suggested serious opposition rather than random harassment. Jennifer Brooks became noticeably agitated when city inspectors began showing up at her property listings, asking pointed questions about disclosure requirements and safety violations. Amanda Pierce's mood darkened as several brands postponed planned collaborations pending review of her account metrics and audience authenticity. But Frank's real masterstroke was still coming. He'd identified the perfect opportunity to deliver. His message in person, in a setting where all three parents would be present and unable to escape or control the narrative. The monthly Parent-Teacher Association meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Frank had every intention of attending. Not as the invisible janitor who cleaned up after their children, but as a concerned parent with information these families definitely didn't want to become public knowledge. Sophia noticed the change in her father's demeanor, even though he tried to hide it. There was a quiet intensity about him that reminded her of the way he looked when he was solving complex problems or planning important decisions. When she asked if everything was okay, Frank assured her that some situations were about to improve, that people who thought they could hurt others without consequences were about to learn otherwise. He didn't give her details, but his confidence was infectious, enough to restore some of her own hope. The weekend brought a temporary lull in the harassment, but Frank knew it was just the calm before the storm. Dylan, Madison, and Ethan had noticed their parents' increased stress levels and were smart enough to realize that something had changed in the dynamic they'd been exploiting. But children who'd never faced real consequences for their actions didn't know how to adjust their behavior when the rules suddenly shifted. They were about to discover that the quiet janitor they'd dismissed as powerless had been gathering ammunition for a counterattack that would destroy their sense of invulnerability forever. Frank spent Sunday evening preparing for Tuesday's PTA, meeting with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to much more dangerous situations. He organized his documentation, rehearsed his presentation, and mentally prepared for the confrontation that would either restore his daughter's peace or force them to leave Millbrook entirely. Either outcome was acceptable as long as Sophia learned that her father would never allow her to be destroyed by people who confused wealth with worth, privilege with power. The parents who had taught their children that Frank Martinez was nobody important were about to discover exactly how wrong they'd been. The quiet man with the mop had been many things before he became a janitor, and some skills never fade completely. no matter how long they remain unused. Tuesday evening would remind everyone in Millbrook that underestimating people based on their current circumstances was a dangerous mistake that could have devastating consequences. In less than 60 seconds, 3 successful careers would be reduced to ruins. 3 carefully constructed reputations would be shattered beyond repair, and 3 families would learn that the man they dismissed as powerless had been gathering information about their darkest secrets all along. The countdown to their destruction had already begun, and none of them had any idea what was coming. The atmosphere at Riverside Elementary School had grown increasingly toxic as Dylan Chen's confidence reached dangerous new heights. Armed with what he believed was his father's legal protection and his family's social influence, Dylan began orchestrating harassment campaigns that went far beyond typical schoolyard bullying. He'd recruited a network of students who either feared his retaliation or craved his approval, creating a systematic operation designed to make Sophia Martinez's daily existence unbearable. Monday morning brought a new level of psychological warfare that revealed adult coaching in its sophistication. Dylan had learned to document his interactions with Sophia, using his phone to record conversations, where he would bait her into responses that could be edited to make her appear aggressive or unstable. He'd approach her in hallways when she was alone, make inflammatory comments about her father's employment, then start recording when she tried to defend herself. The edited footage would later be shared among students as evidence that Sophia was emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. Madison Pierce had elevated social exclusion to an art form, using her mother's lessons in audience manipulation to isolate Sophia from potential friendships and support networks. She'd created group chats specifically designed to exclude Sophia, while ensuring she knew about their existence, organized study sessions and social gatherings with elaborate planning that pointedly left out only one person, and coordinated outfit choices among her followers that would make Sophia's simpler clothing appear more obviously different. The psychological impact was devastating because it made Sophia's exclusion appear organic rather than orchestrated. Ethan Brooks had become the group's enforcer, specializing in physical intimidation that stayed just below the threshold of obvious violence. He would accidentally shoulder-check Sophia in crowded hallways, step on her feet during class transitions, and knock books from her hands while maintaining plausible deniability. His timing was impeccable, always striking when teachers were distracted or looking elsewhere, and his innocent expressions afterward were so convincing that Sophia began to doubt her own perceptions of his intentional aggression. The campaign had expanded beyond the 3 primary bullies to include a broader network of students who participated either through active collaboration or passive enablement. Children who might normally have befriended Sophia were warned away through whispered threats and social pressure. Those who tried to show her kindness were quickly targeted for harassment themselves, creating a climate of fear that made standing up for Sophia feel dangerous and socially costly. Mrs. Thompson had begun to notice the isolation surrounding Sophia, but couldn't quite identify its source or scope. She observed that Sophia seemed increasingly withdrawn during class discussions, that her normally enthusiastic participation had become cautious and measured. When she tried to address the situation by pairing Sophia with different students for group projects, she discovered that many children claimed to already have partners or made excuses to avoid working with her. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't prove deliberate coordination without evidence that the students were careful not to provide. Principal Rebecca Hayes was aware that something was creating tension within the school's social dynamics, but her understanding was filtered through reports from other staff members who'd only witnessed fragments of the larger campaign. The bullying was sophisticated enough that each incident appeared minor, when viewed in isolation, creating a situation where authority figures couldn't grasp the cumulative psychological impact on Sophia. The perpetrators had learned to operate within the gaps of adult supervision, striking when they were least likely to face immediate consequences. Frank's observations during his cleaning duties had revealed the full scope of the harassment network and its operational methods. He'd witnessed the carefully timed accidents that left Sophia scrambling to collect scattered books and papers. He'd overheard the planning sessions where students coordinated their exclusion tactics and practiced their innocent expressions for when adults inquired about their behavior. Most damaging, he'd seen the recordings being made and shared, understanding that his daughter was being systematically documented and humiliated for the entertainment of her tormentors. The breaking point came during Thursday's lunch period when Dylan Chen orchestrated his most ambitious humiliation yet. He'd spent days preparing for what he called Operation Cleanup, a coordinated assault designed to force Sophia into a public breakdown that could be recorded and shared as proof of her instability. The plan involved multiple students working in sequence to overwhelm Sophia's ability to cope while ensuring that the entire incident appeared spontaneous rather than premeditated. The attack began when Madison Pierce accidentally spilled chocolate milk across Sophia's lunch table while she was reading, soaking her book and forcing her to move to another location. As Sophia tried to clean up the mess, Ethan Brooks bumped into her chair, causing her to drop her fresh lunch tray and scatter food across the floor. While she knelt to collect the scattered items, Dylan Chen began recording, loudly commenting about people who couldn't handle simple tasks like eating lunch without creating disasters. Other students joined the commentary as planned, creating a circle of laughter and mockery around Sophia while she tried to salvage her meal and dignity. The psychological pressure was immense because Sophia understood that any emotional response would be captured and weaponized against her, but remaining calm while being systematically humiliated required superhuman self-control. The other children in the cafeteria watched the spectacle with the mixture of fascination and relief that comes from seeing someone else targeted for group cruelty. Mrs. Thompson arrived at the scene too late to witness the coordination, but in time to see Sophia on her hands and knees collecting scattered food while a group of students filmed and laughed. When she demanded explanations, she received the standard responses about accidents and misunderstandings, with each participant claiming innocence while maintaining their phones and smirks. Sophia, when questioned, simply said she'd been clumsy and asked for permission to eat in the library, where she could avoid further accidents. Frank learned about Thursday's incident not from Sophia directly, but from his own investigation into the social media accounts where the footage had been shared. The edited video made Sophia appear uncoordinated and emotionally fragile, with her tormentors positioned as innocent bystanders rather than orchestrators. The comments beneath the video revealed the extent of the harassment network and the pleasure these children took in their systematic cruelty. What disturbed Frank most was recognizing sophisticated editing techniques that suggested adult assistance in creating maximum humiliation value from raw footage. That evening's conversation with Sophia revealed the true psychological toll of months of sustained harassment. She'd begun to internalize the messages being sent about her worth and social acceptability, questioning whether she really was as different and problematic as her tormentors claimed. The most heartbreaking moment came when Sophia asked Frank if he thought she would be happier if she tried harder to fit in, maybe cared less about school and more about the social dynamics that seemed to matter so much to her classmates. Frank recognized the signs of someone whose sense of self was being systematically destroyed by people who understood exactly how to break another person's spirit without leaving obvious evidence. Sophia wasn't just being bullied, she was being psychologically dismantled by children who'd been taught that other people's pain was entertainment and that social power justified any cruelty necessary to maintain it. The campaign against her wasn't random violence, but calculated psychological warfare designed to make her disappear either literally or figuratively. Friday brought escalation that confirmed Frank's assessment of the situation's trajectory. Dylan Chen had grown so confident in his immunity from consequences that he'd begun making direct threats about his father's ability to influence Sophia's academic future. He told her that important families in Millbrook had relationships with college admissions officers, that certain applications might receive less favorable consideration if they came from families who'd caused problems for respected community members. The threat was sophisticated enough to suggest adult coaching and revealed a level of malice that went far beyond childhood conflict. Madison Pierce had expanded her campaign to include Sophia's teachers, spreading rumors about grade manipulation and suggesting that Sophia's academic success was artificially inflated through her father's access to school facilities and information. The accusations were absurd to anyone who knew Sophia's genuine intellectual abilities, but they served their intended purpose of undermining confidence in her achievements and creating doubt about her academic integrity. The rumors also carried implicit threats about what might happen to teachers who continued to recognize Sophia's legitimate accomplishments. Ethan Brooks had begun following Sophia home from school, maintaining enough distance to avoid obvious stalking charges while ensuring she understood that her sense of safety extended nowhere beyond her immediate physical presence. The psychological impact was devastating because it made Sophia feel vulnerable even in spaces she'd previously considered secure. The message was clear. His family's influence extended throughout Millbrook, and nowhere was truly safe from their reach if they decided to escalate their campaign. The coordination between these three primary tormentors had reached military-level precision, with each attack building on previous psychological damage while expanding the scope of Sophia's isolation and vulnerability. They'd learned to document everything in ways that made them appear reasonable, while making Sophia seem increasingly unstable and problematic. Their parents had clearly taught them that controlling narratives was more important than controlling behavior, that perception management could transform any situation to their advantage. Frank spent Friday evening reviewing months of accumulated evidence and planning his response with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to much more dangerous situations. The documentation he'd gathered painted a clear picture of systematic harassment enabled by parental coaching and protected by social privilege. But more importantly, his investigation into the families behind this campaign had revealed vulnerabilities that would allow him to end the harassment permanently while teaching lessons about consequences that would resonate far beyond Riverside Elementary. The weekend brought temporary relief from active harassment, but Frank used the time to finalize preparations for Tuesday's confrontation. He'd identified the perfect moment to deliver his message, calculated the optimal sequence for revealing information that would maximize psychological impact while ensuring complete destruction of his target's credibility and influence. The parents who taught their children that Frank Martinez was powerless were about to discover that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. Sophia noticed the change in her father's demeanor over the weekend, recognizing the quiet intensity that meant he was preparing for something significant. When she asked if everything was okay, Frank assured her that some situations were about to be resolved permanently, that people who thought they could hurt others without facing consequences were about to learn otherwise. He didn't provide details, but his confidence was infectious enough to restore some of Sophia's hope for the future. Monday morning brought a final escalation that confirmed Frank's decision to act decisively. Dylan Chen had convinced several other students to participate in what he called a social experiment, designed to test how much psychological pressure Sophia could withstand before breaking completely. The plan involved systematic exclusion, coordinated insults, and deliberate destruction of her personal property, all carefully timed and documented to create a portfolio of humiliation that could be shared and referenced indefinitely. The attack began during first period, when Madison Pierce announced loudly that Sophia smelled like industrial cleaning chemicals, suggesting that her father's work had contaminated their home environment in ways that made normal social interaction unpleasant. Other students began moving away from Sophia and covering their noses dramatically, creating a theater of disgust that made her appear physically repulsive rather than socially unacceptable. The performance was so convincing that even students who'd previously been neutral began to question whether Sophia really did have hygiene problems. During second period, Ethan Brooks accidentally destroyed Sophia's art project by knocking over a container of paint while walking past her desk. The destruction appeared completely unintentional to Mrs. Patterson, who scolded Ethan briefly before helping Sophia attempt to salvage her work. But Frank had been cleaning nearby windows and had seen Ethan's deliberate movements, the careful positioning that ensured maximum damage while maintaining perfect deniability. The boy's apologetic expression afterward was a masterpiece of manufactured innocence. The campaign continued throughout the day with coordinated accidents and misunderstandings that left Sophia increasingly isolated and emotionally exhausted. By afternoon, she'd stopped trying to participate in class discussions or social interactions, understanding that any attempt to engage normally would be met with calculated cruelty disguised as innocent behavior. The psychological warfare had achieved its intended effect. Sophia was withdrawing from school life entirely, choosing invisible suffering over continued public humiliation. Frank Martinez had seen enough. Tuesday's PTA meeting was less than 24 hours away, and the families responsible for his daughter's systematic destruction were about to learn that their assumptions about power, privilege, and consequences had been fundamentally mistaken. The quiet janitor they'd dismissed as harmless was about to demonstrate exactly how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone based on their current circumstances rather than their actual capabilities and background. The countdown to their destruction had reached its final phase, and Frank was ready to deliver the lesson that would end Dylan, Madison, and Ethan's reign of terror while exposing their parents' corruption and moral bankruptcy to the entire Millbrook community. In less than 60 seconds, 3 carefully constructed reputations would be reduced to ruins, and everyone present would understand that dismissing people based on their job titles was a mistake that could have devastating consequences. The reckoning was coming, and the Martinez family would never be victims again. Tuesday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability that Frank Martinez had been building toward for weeks. The Riverside Elementary School cafeteria had been transformed into a meeting space for the monthly Parent-Teacher Association gathering, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small podium where Principal Rebecca Hayes would normally address routine school business. Tonight's agenda included budget discussions, upcoming fundraising events, and volunteer coordination for the Spring Festival. What it didn't include was the systematic destruction of 3 families' reputations, but Frank had his own plans for the evening's entertainment. The Martinez family arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, with Frank wearing his best khaki pants and a button-down shirt that Sophia had helped him select. He looked like any other concerned parent attending a school meeting, carrying a manila folder that could have contained permission slips or homework questions. Sophia had wanted to come with him, curious about what her father planned to address during the public comment period, but Frank had gently insisted that she stay home with their neighbor, Mrs. Santos. Some conversations, he'd explained, were better handled by adults alone. Richard Chen arrived 15 minutes early, as was his habit for any gathering where his professional reputation might be relevant. He positioned himself in the front row, close enough to the podium to suggest importance while maintaining optimal visibility for the other parents who might prove useful for networking purposes. His expensive suit and confident posture sent clear signals about his status in the community, and he made sure to greet other attendees with the practiced charm that had served him well in legal and social circles. Jennifer Brooks made her entrance with characteristic flair, wearing designer clothing that probably cost more than Frank's monthly salary and carrying a handbag that served as much as a status symbol as a functional accessory. She scanned the room for potential clients or referral sources, mentally cataloging which parents might be interested in upgrading their housing situations or knew others who could benefit from her real estate expertise. Her smile was perfectly calibrated to suggest both professional competence and personal warmth. Amanda Pierce arrived with her phone already recording, planning to document the meeting for her social media followers under the guise of authentic mommy content about being involved in your child's education. She'd already crafted several posts about the importance of parental engagement and community involvement, positioning herself as the kind of dedicated mother who prioritized her daughter's academic environment. The irony of her performance wasn't lost on Frank, who understood exactly how little she actually cared about educational quality versus social media content opportunities. Principal Hayes called the meeting to order at exactly 7:30, beginning with routine announcements about upcoming events and procedural matters that required parental input or volunteer coordination. The atmosphere was comfortable and predictable, filled with the kind of suburban small talk that characterized most PTA gatherings. Parents discussed carpooling schedules, compared notes about their children's academic progress, and shared recommendations for tutoring services and extracurricular activities. Frank sat quietly in the back row during these preliminary discussions, observing the social dynamics that governed Millbrook's parent community. He noticed how certain families gravitated toward each other based on economic status and social position, how conversations shifted when less affluent parents tried to join established groups, how subtle signals communicated inclusion and exclusion without explicit words. The hierarchy was clear but unspoken, maintained through shared assumptions about who belonged and who merely attended. The budget discussion revealed interesting insights into the community's priorities and values. Wealthy parents advocated for programs that would enhance their children's college applications and social experiences, while working families pushed for basic educational resources and support services. The Chen, Brooks, and Pierce families all spoke eloquently about the importance of maintaining Riverside Elementary's reputation for excellence, though their definition of excellence seemed primarily focused on outcomes that would benefit their own children's futures. When Principal Hayes opened the floor for general comments and concerns, Frank Martinez stood up slowly and walked toward the front of the room. His movement was deliberate but unhurried, and something in his posture suggested that this wasn't a spontaneous decision but a carefully planned moment. The conversations around the room gradually quieted as parents turned their attention toward the man they knew only as the school janitor, curious about what concern could be important enough to bring him to a PTA meeting. Richard Chen's expression shifted from mild curiosity to barely concealed irritation as Frank approached the podium. The lawyer had spent months teaching his son that the Martinez family was irrelevant to their social circle, that people like Frank existed to serve rather than participate in community decision-making. The sight of the janitor preparing to address a gathering of Millbrook's most influential parents felt like a violation of natural order that needed to be corrected quickly and decisively. Jennifer Brooks whispered something to the parent sitting beside her, a comment that generated quiet laughter and knowing looks. Her body language suggested amusement at the presumption of someone from Frank's social class, thinking his opinions mattered in a forum dedicated to serious educational discussion. She'd spent years cultivating relationships with exactly the kind of parents gathered in this room, and Frank's presence threatened to lower the tone of proceedings she considered important for her professional networking. Amanda Pierce immediately began recording more intensively, sensing that whatever was about to happen might generate content that would perform well with her audience. Her influencer instincts recognized potential drama, and she positioned her phone to capture both Frank's presentation and the reactions of other parents. The moment felt like it could become viral content, though she had no idea how completely her own life was about to be dismantled. Frank reached the podium and opened his manila folder with movements that suggested military precision rather than janitorial uncertainty. His first words were delivered in a calm, clear voice that carried easily across the quiet room, and they immediately changed the atmosphere from casual curiosity to intense attention. He began by introducing himself not as the school's custodial staff, but as Sophia Martinez's father, a concerned parent who'd been monitoring his daughter's educational experience at Riverside Elementary. The shift in Frank's presentation style was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Gone was the deferential posture and quiet voice they associated with his work persona. In its place stood a man who spoke with authority and precision, whose command of language and presentation suggested education and experience far beyond what they'd assumed. The transformation was so complete that several parents began questioning whether they'd somehow misidentified him as the janitor. Frank's opening statement addressed the systematic harassment his daughter had endured at Riverside Elementary, but his language was clinical rather than emotional, descriptive rather than accusatory. He outlined specific incidents with dates, times, and witnesses, creating a timeline that revealed coordinated cruelty rather than random childhood conflicts. His presentation style was reminiscent of expert testimony or intelligence briefings, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to conveying critical information to skeptical audiences. The parents responsible for the harassment began shifting uncomfortably as Frank's presentation revealed knowledge of their children's activities that went far beyond what casual observation could provide. Dylan Chen's systematic documentation of harassment, Madison Pierce's social exclusion campaigns, and Ethan Brooks's physical intimidation were described with specificity that suggested sophisticated surveillance and analysis. Frank's voice remained calm and professional, but his words painted a picture of deliberate psychological warfare orchestrated by children who'd clearly received adult guidance. Richard Chen attempted to interrupt the presentation with objections about evidence and proper procedures, but Frank continued speaking without acknowledging the disruption. His background had taught him to maintain narrative control in hostile environments, and a suburban lawyer's bluster was insignificant compared to opposition he'd faced in previous careers. The attempt to silence him actually strengthened his position by demonstrating the defensive reaction he'd anticipated from guilty parties. Jennifer Brooks tried a different approach, suggesting that Frank's concerns would be better addressed through proper channels rather than public accusations that could damage reputations and relationships. Her tone was condescending enough to reveal her assumption that Frank didn't understand appropriate social protocols for handling grievances. She positioned herself as someone trying to help him avoid embarrassing himself further, not realizing that embarrassment was exactly what Frank intended to deliver. Amanda Pierce continued recording while making supportive comments about the importance of addressing bullying concerns, apparently not recognizing that her own daughter was being implicated in systematic harassment. Her influencer persona required her to appear sympathetic to anti-bullying messages, but her actual attention was focused on capturing content that would generate engagement rather than understanding the specific accusations being made. Frank's presentation reached its first crescendo when he began discussing the sophistication of the harassment campaign and the clear evidence of adult coaching in his daughter's tormentor's behavior. He described recording techniques, psychological manipulation strategies, and coordination methods that went far beyond typical childhood cruelty. His analysis revealed that Dylan, Madison, and Ethan hadn't developed these approaches independently, but had been trained by parents who understood exactly how to destroy someone's reputation while maintaining plausible deniability. The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically as Frank's accusations became more specific and his evidence more compelling. Other parents began looking at the Chen, Brooks, and Pierce families with new understanding, recognizing behaviors they'd previously attributed to childhood immaturity as deliberate tactics learned from adult mentors. The comfortable social dynamics that had governed previous meetings dissolved as accusations of systematic harassment and parental manipulation created divisions between families. Principal Hayes attempted to regain control of the meeting by suggesting that specific grievances should be addressed through official complaint procedures rather than public forums. But Frank's presentation had moved beyond individual incidents to broader patterns of behavior that implicated the entire community's tolerance for systematic cruelty. His analysis revealed how Millbrook's social hierarchy enabled harassment by protecting perpetrators whose families had influence while isolating victims whose families lacked comparable resources. Frank's tone remained measured and professional as he transitioned from describing his daughter's harassment to discussing his investigation into the families responsible. He explained that concerned parents naturally research the backgrounds of people whose children interact with their own kids, particularly when those interactions become problematic. His approach positioned his investigation as reasonable due diligence rather than invasive surveillance, establishing the legitimacy of information he was about to reveal. The moment Frank began reading from Richard Chen's professional records, the room's tension escalated to a breaking point. Client complaints, billing irregularities, and ethical violations were presented with the same clinical precision Frank had used to describe his daughter's harassment. Bar association investigations, disciplinary actions, and settlement agreements became public knowledge for the first time, destroying carefully maintained professional reputation in minutes rather than months. Richard's face went white as Frank revealed information that should have remained confidential, exposing professional misconduct that could destroy his legal career if properly investigated. The accusations weren't speculation or hearsay, but documented facts drawn from official records and court filings. Frank's presentation demonstrated not only access to damaging information, but also the analytical skills necessary to understand its legal and professional implications. Jennifer Brooks received similar treatment as Frank detailed real estate fraud, commission manipulation, and tax evasion schemes that revealed systematic corruption in her business practices. Property manipulation, client deception, and regulatory violations were described with specificity that suggested comprehensive investigation rather than casual observation. Her carefully cultivated image as a trustworthy professional dissolved as Frank revealed the criminal enterprises hidden beneath her success. Amanda Pierce's influencer empire received the most devastating analysis because Frank's presentation revealed not only fraud, but child exploitation that implicated her treatment of her own daughter. Audience manipulation, sponsor deception, and tax fraud were accompanied by evidence of child labor violations and emotional abuse disguised as content creation. Her entire online persona was exposed as criminal enterprise that monetized her daughter's childhood without consent or protection. The 60-second destruction Frank had promised began when he started reading phone numbers for regulatory agencies, law enforcement departments, and professional oversight organizations. Bar associations, real estate commissions, tax authorities, and child protective services all received detailed reports about the criminal activities he documented. The information had been submitted before the meeting, ensuring that investigations would begin regardless of how his targets responded to public exposure. Richard Chen's legal career effectively ended when Frank revealed that copies of client complaint files had been forwarded to the State Bar Association, along with evidence of tax fraud that would trigger federal investigation. Professional licenses could be suspended pending investigation, and criminal charges were likely given the documented evidence of systematic client deception and financial fraud. Jennifer Brooks faced similar destruction as real estate commission. Investigators received evidence of fraud that would result in license revocation and criminal prosecution. Her business relationships with mortgage brokers and appraisers implicated broader networks in federal fraud investigations that would destroy entire professional communities. The scope of her corruption guaranteed that cooperation with prosecutors would be her only hope for avoiding lengthy imprisonment. Amanda Pierce's influencer career disintegrated instantly as major brands received evidence of audience fraud that violated federal advertising regulations and contractual obligations. Child Protective Services opened investigations into exploitation, allegations that could result in custody loss and criminal prosecution. Her online presence became a liability rather than an asset as sponsor relationships evaporated and platform partnerships were terminated. The parents who had taught their children that Frank Martinez was powerless watched their own lives collapse in real time as systematic corruption was exposed to community scrutiny and regulatory investigation. Their confident assumption that social status provided immunity from consequences proved catastrophically wrong when confronted by someone whose background included skills they'd never imagined a janitor might possess. Frank's final words addressed the broader community's responsibility for enabling systematic harassment through social hierarchies that protected perpetrators while isolating victims. His presentation revealed how Millbrook's comfortable suburban facade concealed tolerance for cruelty that destroyed children's lives while advancing adult social and economic interests. The lesson extended far beyond individual families to encompass community values and institutional accountability. As Frank returned to his seat, the cafeteria remained silent, except for the sound of 3 families' lives disintegrating in real time. Phone calls to lawyers, damage control specialists, and crisis management firms began immediately, but the comprehensive nature of Frank's investigation had eliminated most options for limiting exposure or avoiding consequences. The evidence was too extensive, the regulatory agencies too numerous, and the criminal implications too serious for normal reputation management strategies. Sophia Martinez would return to school the next day to find that Dylan Chen's family had left Millbrook overnight, fleeing investigations that would follow them anywhere they tried to relocate. Madison Pierce would be removed from her mother's custody pending child exploitation investigations that revealed systematic abuse disguised as content creation. Ethan Brooks would discover that his family's real estate empire had collapsed as federal fraud investigations exposed criminal conspiracies that reached far beyond individual misconduct. The quiet man with the mop had reminded everyone in Millbrook that underestimating people based on their current circumstances rather than their actual capabilities was a dangerous mistake that could have devastating consequences. Frank Martinez had spent 4 years building a new life in Ohio, but some skills never fade completely, regardless of how long they remain unused. The parents who had dismissed him as powerless had learned too late that their assumptions about social hierarchy and immunity from consequences were fundamentally and catastrophically wrong. The aftermath of Frank Martinez's devastating presentation at the PTA meeting rippled through Millbrook like an earthquake, shattering the carefully constructed facades that had protected the town's most influential families for years. Within hours of the meeting's conclusion, emergency phone calls were being made to attorneys, public relations specialists, and damage control experts as 3 prominent families realized that their lives had been irreversibly altered by 60 seconds of methodical exposure delivered by a man they'd systematically underestimated. Richard Chen's law office became a scene of controlled chaos as partners and associates scrambled to assess the damage to their firm's reputation and financial stability. The detailed evidence Frank had presented about billing irregularities, client manipulation, and ethical violations had been forwarded to the Ohio State Bar Association before the meeting even began, ensuring that investigations would proceed regardless of any immediate damage control efforts. Richard's attempts to dismiss the accusations as fabricated or exaggerated were undermined by the specificity and documentation Frank had provided, making denial impossible and damage limitation the only viable strategy. The Bar Association's preliminary investigation revealed violations serious enough to warrant immediate suspension of Richard's license, pending a full review of his professional conduct over the past 5 years. Client trust accounts were frozen as auditors examined financial records for evidence of misappropriation and fraud. The prestigious law firm that had been built on Richard's reputation began hemorrhaging clients as news of the investigation spread through Millbrook's professional community, creating a cascade of financial and reputational damage that would take years to resolve, even under the best circumstances. Richard's personal finances faced equally devastating scrutiny as tax authorities launched comprehensive audits of his income reporting and deduction claims over the previous decade. The discrepancies Frank had identified between reported income and visible lifestyle expenditures triggered investigations that would examine every aspect of the Chen family's financial activities. Hidden assets, offshore accounts, and manipulated business expenses were systematically uncovered by investigators who possessed both the authority and expertise necessary to pierce sophisticated financial deception schemes. The family's social standing in Millbrook evaporated overnight as other parents realized that their association with the Chens could damage their own reputations by proximity. Country club memberships were quietly suspended, social invitations were withdrawn, and business relationships were terminated as the community distanced itself from a family whose criminal activities had been exposed in such a public and humiliating manner. Dylan Chen's classmates were instructed by their parents to avoid any contact that might be misconstrued as continued friendship or support. Jennifer Brooks faced equally comprehensive destruction as real estate regulatory agencies launched investigations that would examine every transaction she'd conducted over her entire career. The evidence Frank had provided about dual representation schemes, property manipulation, and mortgage fraud triggered federal investigations that implicated mortgage brokers, appraisers, and bank officials in systematic conspiracies to defraud buyers, sellers, and lending institutions. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that federal prosecutors began considering RICO charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. Jennifer's real estate license was immediately suspended, pending investigation, effectively ending her career in an industry that required trust and credibility to function. Her existing clients began canceling contracts and demanding refunds as news of the fraud allegations spread through Millbrook's real estate market. Property transactions that Jennifer had facilitated were examined for evidence of manipulation and fraud, creating legal exposure for dozens of families who had unknowingly participated in criminal schemes disguised as legitimate real estate deals. The financial implications of Jennifer's exposure extended far beyond her personal assets to include civil liability for damages caused by her fraudulent practices. Homeowners who had overpaid due to appraisal manipulation, buyers who had qualified for loans through falsified documentation, and sellers who had been defrauded through dual representation schemes all became potential plaintiffs in lawsuits that could bankrupt the Brooks family, even if criminal charges were somehow avoided. Insurance companies began canceling policies and bonds that protected Jennifer's professional activities, leaving her personally liable for damages that could reach millions of dollars. Jennifer's carefully cultivated image as Millbrook's premier real estate professional was replaced by notoriety as a criminal whose fraudulent activities had endangered the financial security of dozens of families. Former clients who had praised her expertise began questioning every aspect of their transactions, wondering whether their trust had been betrayed and their financial interests sacrificed for Jennifer's personal profit. The social networks she had spent years building for professional advantage became sources of isolation and hostility as former associates distanced themselves from association with criminal behavior. Amanda Pierce's influencer empire collapsed with spectacular speed as major brands and platform partners terminated relationships that had taken years to develop. The evidence Frank had provided about audience manipulation, engagement fraud, and false advertising triggered federal investigations under consumer protection laws that treated her social media presence as a criminal enterprise rather than legitimate business activity. Sponsored content that had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue became evidence of wire fraud and conspiracy charges that could result in lengthy federal imprisonment. The child exploitation allegations proved even more devastating. To Amanda's personal life, as family court judges issued emergency orders removing Madison from her custody pending investigation of systematic abuse disguised as content creation. Child Protective Services had documented evidence that Amanda had been using her daughter as unpaid labor for commercial content while claiming the income on her own tax returns, violations that constituted both child labor law violations and tax fraud. The scope of Madison's exploitation was so extensive that prosecutors were considering federal trafficking charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences. Amanda's online persona, which had been carefully crafted to appear authentic and relatable, was revealed as systematic deception designed to manipulate audiences and defraud sponsors. The artificial followers, purchased engagement, and fabricated lifestyle content constituted false advertising on a scale that violated multiple federal regulations governing commercial speech and consumer protection. Platform partnerships that had formed the foundation of her income were terminated as companies sought to distance themselves from fraudulent practices that could damage their own reputations and regulatory standing. The psychological impact on Madison Pierce was particularly tragic because she had been raised to believe that her value was determined by her ability to generate content and engagement for her mother's commercial purposes. Family counselors and child advocates began working to help Madison understand that her childhood had been systematically monetized without her consent or understanding, creating trauma that would require years of therapy to address. The transition from being a prop in her mother's commercial enterprise to being a normal child with privacy and protection would be complicated by years of exploitation, disguised as family bonding. Sophia Martinez returned to Riverside Elementary School the following Monday to find a completely transformed social environment where her former tormentors had either disappeared entirely or been so thoroughly discredited that their influence had evaporated overnight. Dylan Chen's family had fled Millbrook during the weekend, apparently hoping to escape the investigations and legal proceedings that would follow them regardless of their location. Madison Pierce was living with relatives in another state while family court proceedings determined her permanent custody arrangements. Ethan Brooks remained in town, but had become a social pariah whose family's criminal activities made association with him dangerous for other students' reputations. The student body's reaction to the revelations about their classmates' families was complex and revealing. Many children who had participated in the harassment campaign against Sophia began experiencing their own social isolation as parents instructed them to avoid behaviors that had been exposed as criminal rather than merely cruel. The sophisticated bullying techniques that had been taught and encouraged by the Chen, Brooks, and Pierce families were suddenly recognized as preparation for adult criminal behavior rather than normal childhood social dynamics. Teachers and administrators at Riverside Elementary began implementing new policies designed to identify and address systematic harassment before it could escalate to the levels Sophia had endured. The recognition that parents had been coaching children in psychological manipulation and evidence destruction techniques prompted training programs for staff members who had previously assumed that bullying was always a spontaneous childhood phenomenon rather than something that could be systematically organized and directed by adults with criminal intentions. Principal Rebecca Hayes used the scandal as an opportunity to examine the school's culture and policies regarding social hierarchy and exclusionary behavior. The revelation that affluent families had been teaching their children to view less privileged classmates as acceptable targets for systematic harassment prompted discussions about institutional responsibility for enabling or preventing such behavior. New reporting mechanisms and intervention protocols were developed to ensure that future incidents would be identified and addressed before they could cause the kind of psychological damage Sophia had experienced. Mrs. Thompson, Sophia's teacher, began paying closer attention to social dynamics in her classroom and implementing activities designed to promote inclusion and empathy rather than competition and hierarchy. The recognition that several of her students had been participating in systematic harassment while maintaining excellent academic performance prompted examination of how social and emotional education could be integrated with traditional academic instruction to prevent future incidents. Frank Martinez's reputation in Millbrook underwent a complete transformation as community members realized that their assumptions about his background and capabilities had been fundamentally wrong. The respect he had earned through his methodical destruction of 3 criminal families extended beyond admiration for his tactical skills to recognition of his character and integrity. Parents who had previously ignored or dismissed him began seeking his opinions on school policies and community issues, understanding that his insights were valuable regardless of his current employment. The mystery surrounding Frank's previous career became a source of fascination and speculation throughout Millbrook as residents tried to understand how a school janitor had acquired the investigative skills and presentation abilities necessary to systematically destroy 3 successful families in a matter of minutes. Some suspected military intelligence background, others theorized corporate security experience, and a few wondered about law enforcement training. But Frank maintained his characteristic discretion about personal history while focusing on his daughter's recovery and academic future. Sophia's academic performance, which had begun to suffer under the stress of systematic harassment, returned to its previous excellence as she regained confidence in her abilities and safety at school. The support she received from classmates who had previously been afraid to associate with her created new friendships based on mutual respect rather than social convenience. Her teachers noticed renewed enthusiasm for learning and participation that reflected her relief at being able to focus on education rather than survival. The broader Millbrook community experienced a period of introspection and reform, as residents recognized that their tolerance for social hierarchy and exclusionary behavior had enabled systematic cruelty and criminal activity. Community organizations began examining their own practices and policies to ensure that they promoted inclusion and accountability rather than privilege and immunity from consequences. The comfortable assumptions about social order and appropriate behavior that had characterized suburban life were questioned and revised in light of the revelations about the Chen, Brooks, and Pierce families. Local law enforcement agencies implemented new training programs designed to recognize and investigate sophisticated harassment campaigns that might not appear criminal when viewed as isolated incidents, but constituted systematic abuse when examined comprehensively. The recognition that children were being trained by parents to engage in psychological warfare techniques prompted collaboration between schools, social services, and law enforcement to develop intervention strategies that could address family-based criminal behavior before it caused lasting damage to victims. The three families whose criminal activities had been exposed faced years of legal proceedings and financial devastation that would serve as permanent reminders of the consequences of assuming that social status provided immunity from accountability. Richard Chen's legal career was permanently destroyed, and he faced potential imprisonment for fraud and ethical violations that had been systematically documented over years of criminal practice. Jennifer Brooks's real estate empire collapsed entirely, leaving her facing federal fraud charges and civil liability that would require decades to resolve. Amanda Pierce's influencer career was terminated permanently, and she faced federal charges related to child exploitation and advertising fraud that carried severe penalties. The children of these three families would grow up understanding that their parents' criminal behavior had consequences that extended far beyond immediate legal penalties to include permanent social stigma and educational disruption. Dylan Chen would attend schools where his family's reputation preceded him, making normal social development difficult and constantly reminding him of the price of systematic cruelty. Madison Pierce would require years of therapy to recover from her mother's exploitation while learning to distinguish between genuine relationships and commercial manipulation. Ethan Brooks would navigate adolescence and young adulthood with the knowledge that his family's criminal activities had been exposed in the most public and humiliating manner possible. Frank Martinez had achieved something remarkable in Millbrook by demonstrating that systematic injustice could be addressed through methodical investigation and strategic exposure rather than violence or illegal retaliation. His approach had been entirely legal and ethical while being devastatingly effective, providing a model for how seemingly powerless individuals could hold corrupt and abusive people accountable through intelligence, preparation, and tactical precision. The lesson resonated throughout the community and served as a reminder that assuming someone is helpless based on their current circumstances rather than their actual capabilities is a dangerous mistake that can have catastrophic consequences. Sophia Martinez's experience became a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing and addressing systematic harassment before it causes permanent psychological damage, but also a success story about resilience, family support, and community accountability. Her recovery and academic success demonstrated that children could overcome even sophisticated cruelty when they received appropriate support and when the adults responsible for enabling abuse faced genuine consequences for their behavior. The quiet man with the mop had reminded everyone in Millbrook that underestimating people based on their job titles or social status was a fundamental error that could result in complete destruction of carefully constructed lives built on criminal foundations. Frank Martinez had spent years observing, learning, and preparing, while his daughter's tormentors assumed he was powerless to protect her or hold them accountable. Their mistake had cost them everything they had worked to build, while teaching the entire community that justice could be achieved through intelligence and determination rather than wealth and influence. 6 months after the devastating PTA meeting that changed everything in Millbrook, the ripple effects of Frank Martinez's strategic demolition of 3 prominent families continued to reshape the community in ways that extended far beyond anyone's initial expectations. The quiet revolution that had begun with a janitor's methodical response to his daughter's systematic harassment had evolved into a comprehensive examination of power structures, accountability mechanisms, and social justice that would define Millbrook's character for generations to come. The federal investigations triggered by Frank's evidence had expanded into a comprehensive examination of corruption networks that reached far beyond the Chen, Brooks, and Pierce families. Richard Chen's legal practice had served as a hub for various criminal enterprises, providing sophisticated legal cover for fraud schemes that implicated dozens of other professionals throughout Ohio's legal and business communities. Jennifer Brooks's real estate manipulation had connected mortgage brokers, appraisers, and banking officials in conspiracies that had defrauded hundreds of families across multiple states. Amanda Pierce's influencer fraud had revealed platform manipulation schemes that involved thousands of fake accounts and fraudulent engagement networks operating on a national scale. The scope of criminal activity that Frank's investigation had uncovered prompted federal task forces to establish permanent offices in Millbrook and surrounding communities, recognizing that sophisticated white-collar crime networks had been operating with impunity for years under the protection of social status and community influence. The assumption that suburban communities were immune to organized criminal activity had been shattered by revelations about the systematic nature of corruption that had been hidden beneath Millbrook's veneer of respectability and prosperity. Richard Chen's imprisonment had become inevitable, as federal prosecutors developed overwhelming evidence of his participation in money laundering, tax evasion, and client fraud that spanned more than a decade. His law license had been permanently revoked, his assets had been seized to compensate victims of his criminal schemes, and his family had been forced to relocate multiple times as community hostility followed them wherever they attempted to rebuild their lives. Dylan Chen, now attending public school in a distant state under his mother's maiden name, struggled with behavioral problems and academic difficulties that reflected the psychological impact of watching his family's complete social and financial destruction. The criminal prosecution of Richard had revealed the sophisticated methods he had used to train Dylan in psychological manipulation and intimidation techniques, treating his son's bullying activities as preparation for adult criminal behavior rather than typical childhood social conflicts. Family court proceedings had resulted in supervised visitation arrangements that required Richard to undergo extensive psychological evaluation and parenting classes before he could have unsupervised contact with his son. The recognition that Dylan had been systematically trained to view other people as objects to be manipulated or destroyed prompted intensive therapy designed to reverse years of criminal socialization. Jennifer Brooks had accepted a plea agreement that required her to cooperate with federal investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence that would still result in years of imprisonment and permanent exclusion from the real estate industry. Her testimony had implicated dozens of other professionals in fraud schemes that had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while destroying the financial security of vulnerable families who had trusted her professional expertise. The civil lawsuits filed by victims of her fraud would continue for years, ensuring that any future income would be garnished to compensate people whose lives had been damaged by her criminal activities. The Brooks family's social rehabilitation had proven impossible, as Jennifer's criminal activities had been so extensive and well documented that no community was willing to accept them without suspicion and hostility. Ethan Brooks had been enrolled in specialized educational programs designed to address the psychological damage caused by his mother's criminal lifestyle and his own participation in systematic harassment campaigns. The recognition that he had been raised to view other people's suffering as entertainment required intensive intervention to develop empathy and moral reasoning that should have been learned during early childhood development. Amanda Pierce's prosecution had attracted national attention as her case highlighted the growing problem of child exploitation in social media environments where commercial pressures created incentives for parents to monetize their children's privacy and emotional development. Federal charges related to child labor violations, tax fraud, and false advertising had resulted in a lengthy prison sentence that would separate her from Madison during crucial developmental years. The platform manipulation schemes she had operated were used as evidence in congressional hearings about social media regulation and child protection in digital environments. Madison Pierce's recovery had become a model program for children who had been systematically exploited by parents who prioritized commercial success over their children's welfare and development. The therapy and educational support she received addressed not only the immediate trauma of family separation and public exposure, but also the deeper psychological damage caused by years of being treated as a commercial product rather than a human being with intrinsic worth and dignity. Her academic and social progress demonstrated that children could recover from even sophisticated forms of exploitation when they received appropriate support and protection. The foster family that had been selected to care for Madison represented the kind of stable, nurturing environment that prioritized her emotional and educational development over any commercial or social media opportunities. The contrast between her current life and her previous existence as a prop in her mother's commercial enterprise provided stark illustration of how children's welfare could be protected when adults prioritize genuine care over financial exploitation and social media fame. Sophia Martinez had emerged from her ordeal as a confident, articulate young woman whose academic excellence and social leadership reflected her complete recovery from the systematic harassment she had endured. Her experience had motivated her to become an advocate for other children facing bullying and abuse, using her own story to help adults recognize and address sophisticated harassment campaigns before they caused lasting psychological damage. Her presentations to parent groups and educational conferences demonstrated remarkable poise and insight that inspired comprehensive reforms in anti-bullying policies and community accountability mechanisms. The scholarship opportunities that had emerged from Sophia's advocacy work reflected the recognition that her intellectual abilities and personal resilience represented exactly the kind of leadership that universities and foundations sought to support. Her essays about overcoming systematic harassment and her father's strategic response to injustice had attracted attention from admissions officers who recognized that her experiences had prepared her for challenges and responsibilities that few students her age could understand or handle effectively. Sophia's relationship with her father had deepened through their shared experience of confronting systematic injustice and achieving accountability through intelligence and strategic planning rather than violence or illegal retaliation. Frank's demonstration that seemingly powerless individuals could hold corrupt and abusive people accountable had provided Sophia with a model for addressing future challenges that emphasized preparation, documentation, and strategic thinking over emotional reactions or wishful thinking about fairness and justice. Frank Martinez's role in Millbrook had evolved from invisible janitor to respected community leader whose insights about institutional accountability and social justice were sought by organizations throughout the region. His background remained deliberately mysterious, but his demonstrated abilities in investigation, analysis, and strategic planning had established his credibility on issues related to corruption, prevention, and community safety. Parent groups, school boards, and local government agencies regularly consulted with Frank about policies and procedures designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had threatened his daughter's welfare and development. The cleaning company that employed Frank had promoted him to a supervisory position that recognized his leadership abilities while allowing him to maintain the flexible schedule necessary for his community involvement and Sophia's educational support. His colleagues had developed profound respect for his professionalism and expertise, understanding that his custodial work reflected personal choice rather than limited capabilities or opportunities. The assumption that janitors were necessarily uneducated or lacking in skills had been permanently challenged by Frank's demonstration of sophisticated analytical and presentation abilities. The mystery surrounding Frank's previous career had become a source of respectful curiosity rather than intrusive speculation, as community members recognized that some people had legitimate reasons for maintaining privacy about their backgrounds while contributing positively to their current environments. The recognition that many individuals possess skills and experiences that weren't reflected in their current employment had prompted broader conversations about how communities could better utilize the human resources available to them, regardless of job titles or social status assumptions. Riverside Elementary School had implemented comprehensive anti-bullying programs that addressed not only obvious physical aggression, but also the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that had been used against Sophia. Teachers and administrators received training in recognizing systematic harassment campaigns that might appear as isolated incidents when viewed individually, but constituted coordinated abuse when examined comprehensively. The recognition that parents might be coaching children in criminal behavior techniques prompted collaboration with law enforcement and social services to develop intervention strategies that could address family-based criminal socialization. The school's culture had shifted dramatically as students and parents recognized that systematic cruelty and exclusionary behavior had serious consequences that extended far beyond immediate social dynamics to include potential criminal liability and permanent reputation damage. The comfortable assumptions about acceptable behavior and social hierarchy that had characterized previous generations were replaced by explicit expectations of inclusion, empathy, and respect for individual dignity, regardless of family background or economic status. Principal Rebecca Hayes had used the scandal as an opportunity to examine and reform institutional practices that had enabled systematic harassment while appearing to maintain appropriate educational standards and social order. The recognition that affluent families had been using their influence to protect children who were engaging in criminal behavior prompted new policies designed to ensure that disciplinary actions were based on actual behavior rather than family status or social connections. The broader Millbrook community had experienced a period of sustained introspection and reform as residents recognized that their tolerance for social hierarchy and exclusionary behavior had enabled systematic criminal activity that had operated with impunity for years. Community organizations had revised their membership policies and governance structures to ensure that influence was based on contribution and character rather than wealth and social status. The comfortable social dynamics that had protected corrupt families from accountability had been replaced by explicit expectations of transparency and ethical behavior. Local law enforcement agencies had developed specialized training programs designed to recognize and investigate sophisticated harassment campaigns and white-collar criminal networks that operated through community influence and social manipulation. The recognition that suburban communities could harbor organized criminal activity had prompted coordination between federal and local agencies to develop prevention and intervention strategies that could address corruption before it became entrenched in community power structures. The economic development initiatives that had emerged from Millbrook's reform process emphasized ethical business practices and community accountability rather than simple growth and prosperity metrics. The recognition that criminal enterprises had been operating under the protection of community status had prompted new screening procedures for business licenses and professional certifications that examined character and integrity rather than simply technical qualifications and financial resources. The educational programs that had been developed in response to the scandal addressed not only bullying prevention, but also critical thinking skills that would help children recognize and resist manipulation techniques that might be used by adults or peers with criminal intentions. The recognition that children could be systematically trained to engage in psychological warfare had prompted curriculum development that emphasized empathy, ethical reasoning, and respect for human dignity as fundamental educational goals rather than optional social skills. The media attention that Millbrook's transformation had attracted had created opportunities for Frank and Sophia to share their experiences with communities facing similar challenges related to systematic harassment and institutional accountability. Their presentations emphasized the importance of documentation, strategic planning, and legal channels for addressing injustice rather than vigilante responses or resignation to inevitable victimization. The recognition that seemingly powerless individuals could achieve justice through intelligence and determination had inspired similar efforts in communities throughout the region. The long-term implications of Frank's strategic response to his daughter's harassment extended far beyond individual justice to encompass fundamental questions about power, privilege, and accountability in American communities. The demonstration that systematic investigation and strategic exposure could hold corrupt individuals accountable, regardless of their social status, had provided a model for addressing institutional injustice that could be replicated in various contexts and circumstances. The families whose criminal activities had been exposed faced decades of consequences that would serve as permanent reminders of the dangers of assuming that social status provided immunity from accountability. Their children would grow up understanding that their parents' choices had created obstacles and limitations that would affect their educational opportunities, social relationships, and professional prospects for the rest of their lives. The recognition that criminal behavior had consequences that extended across generations had prompted serious conversations about ethical responsibility and moral education in families throughout Millbrook and beyond. The quiet man with the mop had achieved something remarkable by demonstrating that justice could be achieved through intelligence, preparation, and strategic action rather than wealth, influence, or violence. Frank Martinez had spent months observing, documenting, and analyzing, while his daughter's tormentors assumed he was powerless to protect her or hold them accountable. Their fundamental miscalculation about his capabilities and resources had cost them everything they had worked to build, while providing a permanent lesson about the dangers of underestimating people based on their current circumstances rather than their actual abilities and determination. Sofia Martinez's experience had become a testament to resilience, family support, and community accountability that demonstrated how children could overcome even sophisticated forms of systematic abuse when they received appropriate protection, and when the adults responsible for enabling that abuse faced genuine consequences for their behavior. Her academic success and social leadership reflected not only her individual strength and intelligence, but also the power of strategic intervention and community reform to create environments where children could thrive regardless of their family's economic status or social position. The transformation of Millbrook from a community that tolerated systematic cruelty and criminal behavior to one that prioritized accountability and ethical behavior had created a model for suburban reform that attracted attention from researchers, policymakers, and community leaders throughout the nation. The recognition that apparently successful communities could harbor organized criminal activity had prompted examinations of similar dynamics in other locations where wealth and status might be protecting corruption from exposure and prosecution. Frank Martinez had reminded everyone who heard his story that assuming someone is helpless based on their job title or social status is a fundamental error that can result in complete destruction of lives built on criminal foundations and corrupt assumptions. The quiet janitor had possessed skills and resources that his daughter's tormentors never imagined, and their miscalculation had taught an entire community that justice could be achieved through intelligence and determination rather than privilege and influence. The lesson would resonate for generations as a reminder that underestimating people based on appearances rather than capabilities is a dangerous mistake that can have catastrophic consequences for those who make it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.